For us to be able to transfer our drapes onto paper, we first need to true the drapes on the muslin itself. Truing is pretty much perfecting your lines that you draped on the dress form, and this is going to help us turn it into a sewing pattern to then prototype. First, I'm going to start with squaring off at the waist for about 1/2 inch, and I'm going to do the same thing at my neckline. And again, this is both at center front, as you can see here. And this just helps the transition from seam lines to be nice and straight and not pointed. Now I'm going to move into truing my bust dart. So I'm going to go ahead and take my ruler and go over my penciled line from before like this. Then I'm going to take my ruler again and line up the side seam of my dart to the vanishing point where my other dart leg ends and draw in a line like this. And then I'm going to just go over the vanishing point just to make sure that I can visually see where it is. And as you can see here, it's not really no longer lined up with my horizontal bust line, but it's still going to read as being a straight dart pointing towards our bust line. So first, I'm going to go ahead and close the dart and making sure that the excess is pointing down towards the waistline like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and just pin that closed for right now. And then I'm going to take my ruler and draw in my side seam. So I'm just going to line up the top of my side seam with the waistline at the bottom and just draw a straight line like this. And then I'm going to add in 1/2 inch seam allowance like so. So now we have 1/2 inch seam allowance at our side seam. Now I'm going to take my hip curve ruler and begin truing the lines for my waist dart. And as you can see, and obviously the lines are not straight, so I have to use my curved ruler to make sure that I can mimic these lines and true them up and really just define what the shape is. And as you can see here, I had to make a little bit of an adjustment to where the vanishing point was on my dart when I drew it in on the form. There was a little bit of a discrepancy, but I went ahead and just made this adjustment. This may happen to you, especially if you're fairly new to draping, but as long as you know the shape of a dart, you'll be fine. You just need to think about what it looks like. So now I'm going to go ahead and close my dart like this. And the reason why I'm doing this is to make sure that both legs are the same length. And as you can see here, there's a little bit of a discrepancy between both dart legs. Both dart legs are about 1/4 of an inch off. So I'm going to go ahead and add my seam allowance to my dart legs like so, because we are turning these into cutaway darts, which means you cut them open with seam allowance added, if that makes sense, as you can see here. Now I am going to go ahead and pin the dart shut like this, and then I'm going to take my curved ruler and retrue the waistline like this. So I'm going to put it up against my waistline and make sure that I'm staying within the dot markings that I marked when I was draping on the form, and just use my ruler to draw in the shape. You may need to do this a few times, or you may need to use more than one spot on the ruler. And then I'm going to go ahead and go over the notch that I marked, which represents my princess seam line on my form. But this will also be used as a matching point for the skirt. And as you can see here, that clears up my waistline seam. So now we have that trued. Going to try and true my armhole, and as you can see here, I had to use a combination of my French curve and my hip curve. And at this point, I had to go ahead and square off the side seam also to make sure that it was going to be straight. And as you can see here, I've lightly drew it in, and then I went ahead and took my ruler and made a straight line for my shoulder seam, and then I drew a straight line for my neck seam. This just helps to make sure that it is nice and straight. And then I went ahead and added seam allowance to my waistline. And now I'm going in and just marking my center front, my waistline, and my side seam, just so that you can see where all of these are in this context. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab my strap piece, and I'm going to draw in the shoulder seam by just drawing in a straight line with my ruler like so, and drawing in the straight line for the bottom edge of my strap like this. That's the part that's going to go into the back bodice. I'm going to fold under the edge on the shoulder seam and butt it up against my shoulder seam of my front bodice and pin it together like this. And as you can see, my dots are pretty well in line with each other, and this is exactly what you want. And I'm going to take my hip ruler and I'm going to just true that those shapes and making sure that there's a smooth transition. And I'm also going to make sure that my neckline looks good. I want it to be slightly curved, so I'm just finding a spot on the ruler that makes sense to use for that, as you can see here. And now I'm going to just finish truing my strap like this. This is the edge where the neckline is. And then I'm going to do the other side, which is my armhole. And as you can see, I still have the excess from when we were draping, the excess that was in our armhole. We're just going to true it out like the way I am here. And we're just going to end up pinning it back together once we put the drape on the form to see how it looks. But don't worry about this. We'll take care of this once we put it on paper. And as you can see, this is what it'll look like. And you're going to go ahead and add seam allowance. I went ahead and started adding my seam allowance. I'm using 1/4 of an inch for the neck and the armhole seams. I drew in 1/2 inch for my strap piece at the end that is going into my back bodice, as you can see here. And then in case you didn't know, I'm using 1/2 inch for the dart and for the waist and side seams. Now I'm going to mark off my shoulder seam just to as a reminder for me not to get these edges mixed up. And here I am going to true my side seam on my back bodice. And as you can see, my back bodice is a lot more simple than my front bodice is. And so I'm going to just square off at the waistline and then at the top of my bodice like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and close my side bust dart on the front of my bodice again. I'm going to turn under the edge of the side seam on the back bodice and place it right up against the side seam of the front bodice, right on the stitch line. And folding under the edges just helps us with lining this up. And as you can see, they're about the same length. And now we're just going to retrue across the top and bottom to make sure that the transition from each piece is nice and smooth and we don't have any weird edges or any weird points. And as you can see here, I had to adjust the transition between my front and my back bodice. And using my hip ruler, I'm just re-smoothing this out and making sure that I like the way this looks and that it makes sense. I'm also going over the notches where my shoulder strap is going to go. And now, as you can see, I'm just doing this all over again with the curved ruler like the way I did with my front bodice and finding a spot on the ruler that makes sense. And as you can see, this is what it'll look like, and the transition from the waist and the top is nice and smooth. Now I am going to, like with my front bodice, so just so you can see, I labeled my center back, my waist, and then my side seam. And at this point, you have all of your trued pieces, and now you're going to cut them all out along the seam allowance, and you are going to begin pinning all of the parts together. So as you can see here, I have my side bust dart already pinned, and I went ahead and also just repinned the excess that was in my armhole, just like the way it looked when we were draping. Pinning together the side seam of my bodice like so, and I'm going to just space pins out as consistently and evenly as I can. This is technically a design school thing. Like, this is how I had to turn in all my draping assignments, but you can technically sew this together also, but this is just the way I prefer to do it because I'm so used to it. So whichever method you prefer, go ahead and get all the major parts together. And I went ahead and pinned my shoulder seams and then my strap to the back bodice where I marked those initial notches. And then the next step is to put this on the form and see how it looks. And again, my excess in the armhole is just pinned on like the way we draped it. And now on the form, this is what it will look like. And as you can see, I have some excess in my neckline and in my shoulder strap. And all I did was pinch these out and just pin them together. And as you can see, also, this also scooted my back strap a little bit farther over. And there's a little bit of an extra space here. So I just need to go ahead and fill in those areas when we put it on paper. And you're going to take note of what those measurements are. And as you can see here too, I went ahead and removed all my pins because this is another trick that tells you whether or not you draped it correctly, because if it lays well on the form, that means it's going to lay well on your body. And this is just a close-up of the drape. And as you can see, like I said before, I do have some excess fabric in my neckline, and if you're wondering what those red dots are, that just means that is where I'm going to be taking off of my neckline because of what happens when I had to reduce or take in the excess in the neckline. But other than the neckline, this is looking pretty good. Everything looks nice and smooth. And again, this is the back bodice. I went ahead and remarked and measured and took note of how much I'm going to have to add to my strap in order for it to make it to my back bodice. Take note of what your personal adjustments are and what you are going to need to do to make those adjustments onto your paper pattern. Yeah, so go ahead and step back and just look at your drape and just look everything over. If there's any seams or anything that you want to add or take away, this would be the time to make note of that. And now we're going to go ahead and move into transferring our drape onto paper. Now, since I already showed you how to true up the drape on muslin, I'm not going to show you that necessarily on paper because it's the same process, but I am going to focus on showing you how I removed the excess from my neckline and from my armhole. That is definitely a common issue that you will come across. So here I am pinning the drape onto paper, and I'm going to take my tracing wheel and I'm going to trace around the shape and my pencil lines like so, but I'm going to be tracing my sew line, not the edge of the seam allowance. And I'm going to also make sure that I trace over the area of the strap that needs to be reduced, and as well as making sure that I am clearly indicating the excess in my armhole and going over the new lines that I made for my armhole. This was kind of a last minute adjustment that I decided to make, but anything that you have to fix, go ahead and go over those lines now. And I went over my dart, as you can see here, clearly indicating my vanishing point. And this is a big one. I'm going to also transfer the horizontal bust line as well as the apex for later reference. I'm going to also transfer the waist notch and make sure that I'm transferring the other dart that I have here. And in case you didn't see before, you also want to draw in your center front line and make sure that that is lined up with your drape. And now I'm going to finish off my side seam. And in case you haven't noticed, I am using a self-healing mat along with my tracing wheel, just because if you don't do this, the tracing wheel will leave markings on your table, especially if you have a wood table like I do. And so now I've removed my drape and I am just going over the lines with my pencil here, making sure that my pencil is nice and sharp and that I'm using my rulers as much as I can. And now I'm going to close in the waist dart, and I went ahead and retrued my waistline across that dart like the way we did on the muslin. And here is where I'm going to make that adjustment for the gaping, for the excess that we had in the armhole and in the neckline. I'm going to draw a line from the armhole on one side of the excess into the bust apex, and then I'm going to draw the other line below it to the bust apex like so. It's going to make a dart shape like so, and then I'm going to redraw my side bust dart legs going into the bust apex, because what we're going to do is we're going to transfer this excess into our side bust dart. And then I'm going to go ahead and move over into the neckline where I had the excess, and I'm going to draw in my lines the same way I did for the armhole, going to 0 at the apex like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and put a piece of tape over the apex just for reinforcement. I'm going to cut down the center of my side bust dart up to but not through the bust apex. And then I'm going to cut along the line closest to the side seam on my armhole excess like so, up to but not through the apex, and you'll see that now you have a little bit of a hinge and it can move. You're going to take that, close it, and you're going to meet that line with the opposite line on the other side of the armhole. Do the same thing for the neckline. You're going to slash on the side closest to the armhole, and then you're going to just close that section out. You're going to close it out. You're going to just take the piece and butt it up against the other line of the excess and tape that shut. And now this is what it'll look like. And we went ahead and transferred the armhole excess and the little bit of excess we had in the neck into the side bust dart. And I'm actually going to turn this into a cutaway dart, which is exactly how I trued it on muslin. I'm going to close the dart, and I'm going to find the center of that dart, and I'm going to draw a new center line from the side seam to the apex, and I'm going to draw my new dart legs from the original vanishing point to the side seam. And you also want to make sure that these dart legs are the exact same length, because since we transferred excess into this area, your dart legs may not be the same anymore. And now you're just going to continue the process of truing and adding your seam allowances the same way we did on the muslin. And this is going to complete your patterns, and you will leave any excess in any areas that you need, such as here where I left extra on my shoulder strap, just in case I need to make any adjustments later on when we're prototyping. And this is really an important step also, because being accurate is super duper important. Once you have all of your pieces trued and with seam allowance, you're going to take your paper scissors and go ahead and cut them out of the paper. And you're going to go ahead and label all of your pieces with grain lines and all the information that you need, such as the name of the piece, how many you need to cut, and out of what fabric. So all my pattern pieces will be cut to out of self and lining fabric. And whether or not you want to trace these all off to have separate self and lining pieces is totally up to you, but I'm going to just be using the same pieces for each fabric. And now we are ready for the next step. Be sure to stay tuned for our prototyping stage. Thank you so much, and see you next time.